Thank you to my channel members and Ko-fi supporters that make these videos possible. You can also support me by buying a deck tech on my weekly Tuesday and Sunday streams. More info in the video description. Hello everyone. I have a question for you all. Would you rather play a short, unsatisfying game of Magic or a 2-hour-long slog game? At least to me, a short, unsatisfying game gives the table the opportunity to adjust what went wrong and shuffle up for a second round, whereas a 2-hour slog game can cause the game night to feel wasted, turning the game at hand into more of a chore rather than a thing being done for entertainment, giving everyone participating FOMO over what a more interesting game could be occurring if they just agreed to scoop and start over. I don't intend to imply that every long game here is a slog, mind you, but I think overwhelmingly the card Farewell creates them more efficiently than any I've seen before when misused. For 6 mana, you can practically exile everything: artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and/or graveyards. Unless you're all in on planeswalkers or lands, Farewell will take your plans and stop them completely with few counters. I do want to come out of the gate and say that Farewell is not a strong card in the grand scheme of things, and none of my arguments will be mentioning its strength. 6 mana is 6 mana. Farewell is expensive, and there's a whole world of from-hand combos and mana screw out there that can make it dead at Commander games classifying themselves as bracket 3 and above. I think the main reason Farewell is hated is because how it is used by most players. It's not necessarily the fault of the user either. When people talk about how annoying or how strong Farewell is, it's often devoid of context. A player hears Farewell is a strong card and don't have a second thought about putting it in their decks. Any of their decks. Even ones that are dedicated to investing creatures onto the board. Giada's second most played board wipe, according to EDHREC data, is Farewell in an utterly baffling 40% of decks. Same with Adeline, who could be argued to be even more married to the board than Giada is, sitting with Farewell at 27% of decks. When a player puts Farewell in a combat-focused deck like this, its impact is still undeniable. You feel like you did a big play when you cast it on game night, sending all 4 modes. It's like a planar reset button. Your opponents bemoan the card and scoop up their non-land permanents. The game continues, though. At a slower pace, for a while, absolutely. But it does continue. When it does, I can't help but feel that it is not often the Giada or Adeline player that ends up winning after that exchange. So in the end, it was an exercise in futility. In these situations, I highly recommend Winds of Abandon in the place of Farewell, as it can be used to break parity when faced with a board of blockers that interrupt your lethal swing. You could argue for Farewell here, saying that exiling all artifacts and enchantments without touching creatures is a way to play the card. My counter to this, though, is that entails that you already have the lead or parity on board, which means, once again, Winds of Abandon would serve you way better. Now, some may note that Winds doesn't entirely serve the same purpose as Farewell, as it A, only affects creatures, and B, is worse when you are behind. The issue here, though, is that while Farewell is stronger than Winds in the context of being behind your opponents, all it does is re-establish parity, and you are the one who spent 6 mana to create it. So you're starting on the back foot in that parity, as a creature deck. Good luck. In this context, Winds can, in a pinch, remove opposing creatures worse than Farewell, but it can also be used in a state of parity to break it to create a win. The ceiling on Winds is higher than the ceiling of Farewell here, while they have comparable floors. Even if Winds isn't your cup of tea, which is a bizarre take to me, honestly, you still have many other options for board wipes. In white, Hour of Revelation can both be dodged with a slew of indestructible granting effects, creating a one-sided board wipe like Winds of Abandon while having a higher floor than Winds, though it does require 2 cards. Hour of Revelation here also cures any woes of Winds not hitting artifacts or enchantments. Now, none of this would be an issue if Farewell was like the previously mentioned Hour of Devastation and destroyed game objects, but the fact that it exiles all in-play material and hits graveyards retroactively too makes it hard for most colors to avoid. Even if Farewell destroyed all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments and then exiled graveyards, it would be a card no one would complain about, I reckon. As it is, only blue with counterspells and phasing, and white with delayed flickers and phasing, can truly dodge Farewell efficiently. And some of white's options are exorbitantly expensive for an average player to just put in any deck. And don't say Perch Protection, as once a card reaches 4 or more mana, it becomes too hard to realistically hold up while maintaining parity with opponents. It is this color hosing property with Farewell countering green and black's ways of maintaining board parity in the face of interaction that is really salt in the wound. The counter to this is that low color decks are inherently going to have weakness, but I would counter with don't play low color decks is the same reason why Iona got banned. There's precedent here. I will take the opportunity now to mention red. What about red then? They get hosed by any board wipe, not just Farewell. Why is it okay as a color weakness for red, but when Farewell does the same to black and green, it's a problem? The answer is twofold. One, red has options to protect their board, like Goblin Bombardment to punish the player who dared draft their token army, and with Tybalt's Trickery, they unironically have a better option than black or green to counter Farewell. Secondly, red as a color is not expected to protect their board from the outset. Are you telling me the same can be said for green? It may sound like I'm whinging at interaction here, but truthfully part of this is that I do think answers should be weaker than protection. The one who establishes tempo and plays around interaction with protection spells should be the one rewarded in Commander as to not have long, boring games of Magic. These players should not be completely blown out and forced into a long slog of a game despite holding up the mana for counterplay. On this note, it is for similar reasons that Ghostly Prison or Propaganda are hated. These and Farewell make the board and combat matter even less in Commander than it does already. Some people might draw the comparison of Farewell to other exile sweepers that already exist, and cards in blue like Evacuation or Cyclonic Rift. For these examples though, the board isn't completely reset in the case of existing exile sweepers or Evacuation, and for Rift, it's one-sided just like Winds is, making it a finisher that will end the game instead of causing it to halt. If you want to look at what a healthier Farewell would look like, I think the wording on Spectacular Pileup is a good example. Undying or Mass Reanimation effects for black will still work. Regeneration for green, phasing for white, countering and phasing for blue, all work against this card while still having the added text to counter the pervasive indestructible keyword. This cat and mouse game of adaptation that protection and removal could have is what Farewell denies at a casual table. It is now that I want to make clear that Farewell can be used in a way that justifies itself in a deck. It has a high ceiling in casual tables that invest a lot of stock in planeswalkers, artifacts, or enchantments, as one of those permanent types is not hit by the card altogether, and the other two can simply be left unnamed when Farewell is cast. This I actually quite enjoy, since it breaks parity with opponents for a mana cost that doesn't feel unfair, creating a winning state for the game that can then be closed in the coming turns, instead of creating a dreaded slog of a game. In a similar way, you can use Thassa's Oracle in a cool way by putting it in a mono-blue Devotion style deck instead of comboing with it. But you'd be the exception and not the rule. It is because of this ability to measure the intent of Farewell in a deck list and lack of being able to meaningfully counter Farewell for certain colors that makes me think it's a perfect candidate for Commander's Game Changer list. Not because it's too strong, but for similar reasons to Tergrid or Jin-Gitaxias, because of its ability to create miserable games of Commander better than any other. It's at brackets 1 and 2 that this will be most prevalent as well, since games are slower and far less focused on from-hand combo wins that are immune to Farewell, like bracket 3 is. The funny thing is, I think by putting Farewell on the Commander Game Changers list, a lot of bracket 1 and 2 decks that are currently running it will actually become stronger after cutting it, since most are just using it over better options because of word of mouth. Some might object to this notion. Now Farewell has to compete for a Game Changer slot in my bracket 3 and above decks. Why would I choose it over a Mox or other more powerful card? I feel like this sentiment makes a big assumption. Brackets aren't meant to be hard rules. They are merely a framework for pre-game discussion to act as a quick litmus test for balancing games. I'm sure that the people will hear Farewell being your fourth game changer in your bracket 3 deck and believe you're not trying to angle shoot them, especially since Farewell will be one of the weaker offenders on the list. The bracket you are in is about intent. It's not merely quantifiable by how many game changers you have. To be clear, I don't think this assumption is too far-fetched. Brackets are in beta, and it could really be explained better how your bracket is determined than it has been. Overall, I find that Farewell's ability to create unfun, artificially long games with such ease, as well as its difficulty to be countered by a majority of Magic's colors, makes it a perfect candidate for game changer status. Even if you disagree, I hope this made you think about how you use Farewell in your decks, or given you some insight into the card's stigma. Do tell me what you think of Farewell and of this video down in the comments below. Also, feel free to tell me your game changer candidate hot takes. Until next time, farewell. In these situations, I highly recommend